We have talked about protein, we have talked about fiber, and now we are going to talk about fat, the third macronutrient and often forgotten macronutrient. In fact, the one that probably has had the most controversy for the last, 80 years.
Something like that.
A little history about fat and the vilification of fat really started in the 40s and the 50s. There was a debate, there was a hot debate whether it was fat that was the driver of cardiovascular disease or if it was carbohydrates that was the driver of cardiovascular disease. And ultimately, fat became the villain of that story. And the researcher that basically led that drive many years later, we found out cherry picked his data and he worked very closely with Harvard School of Medicine, which would later also be part of Harvard School of Public Health. And a lot of all of the future research kind of sat on cherry picked false data. And we unfortunately kind of vilified fat. And it turns out we've created this a cascade of problems when it comes to misinformation and disinformation around how we balance our macronutrients for health. And as we sort of talk about a little bit of the details, you can start to see why that it not only fed the wrong narrative and we sort of misunderstood and potentially started over consuming carbohydrates, but we also missed out on a really important macronutrient, especially when it's used properly. So I'm going to start with a little chemistry. So don't be freaked out. But I find that there's a lot of confusion about the different kinds of fats. And what we want to do is weave the information around so that you can understand the fats a little bit better, understand how to choose them, and then how do they fit into eating a colorful, diverse diet. So, first, the big major categories that we're usually concerned are your saturated fats, your monounsaturated, polyunsaturated. If you are taking a fish oil, if you are heard that olive oil is good for you, if you've been told to avoid or lean into eating more butter, these are all the different kinds of fats and they fall into different categories. One really important thing to keep in mind is that all fats have different kinds of subcategories of fats. There's actually a couple dozen different kinds of subcategories to these fats. So these are very broad terms. And even butter, which we think of as a saturated fat, actually has some polyunsaturated, monounsaturated components to it. So nothing is a pure one kind of fat unless it's manufactured that way. And then I also want to highlight that all of these, to some extent, have some sort of color or contributing polyphenol or other nutrients that piggyback on them. So let's start with butter, which is often vilified. Butter is actually rich in vitamin A and has something called short chain fatty acids, which we'll get to in a minute. And the olive oil, part of the reason olive oil is so good for you. Early research around the Mediterranean diet pinpointed the polyunsaturated fats and monounsaturated fats as healthy and said that's why olive oil is so good for us. But it turns out olive oil actually has a lot of polyphenols, and the darker and richer the color, almost to the point where it turns from yellow to green, it actually has an even more dense amount of polyphenols. So, Sarah, I'll let you kind of jump in here to talk a little bit more about that intersection.
Yeah. So I think with similar to, how we approach color with vegetables and fruit, that you can think about color and fats similarly, and that the ones that are going to be most richly hued are going to be kind of packed with the most of those nutrients like the polyphenols and the, antioxidants and things like that. So I think when you are picking your fat sources, and we are really, you should be picking a variety of them. We'll talk a little bit later about saturated fats, and those have been, particularly vilified. Another thing that you can kind of consider when making those choices is how kind of like rich the color is. So like how rich are your egg yolks, how yellow or even orangey is your butter. And then, as Lara said, the kind of milkier green olive oil is going to be the one that is going to contain all of the, the really, really good, kind of benefits of having olive oil.
Yeah. And even when I think about what we talked about with protein, like I think of nuts and seeds, for example, and they're such a good source of protein. They're also a great source of fiber and a great source of anti-inflammatory fat. So they're kind of a perfect food in that way. They're very well balanced. And I hesitate to ever put them in one specific category, but
Hmm.
they also are colorful in their own way. They come with their
Yep.
own kinds of polyphenols and phytonutrients as well that enhance and add to their benefits. And that's why, we think of them as a heart healthy food, for example, or an anti inflammatory food or a brain food. Even when it comes to animal protein is often marbled with some kind of fat, generally saturated fat, but it does also carry poly and monounsaturated fats. The profiles are just skewed a little bit more towards saturated fats. The way you cook that protein, the herbs that you might use alongside of it, the heat level that you use, all of those are going to play into how that protein is then changed and heated and cooked. And that has its own impact. And I would argue even color plays into that, because if I look at this steak, for example, the deeper the color, the less marbled it is, the less fat there is. Not that I'm saying that that's necessarily better, but that's also going to change the way that that piece of meat cooks and the temperature at which it cooks. So color still actually makes a difference here, even though we're talking about fat. And we often think of fat as being something that doesn't really have a color, but it still counts. So this is where the chemistry comes in. So the only way I can explain polyunsaturated and monounsaturated is to show you the chemical structure. And all it means is that we're referring to those double bonds between the carbons. And polyunsaturated or PUFA fats have two or more double bonds, poly, many saturated bonds. And then a monounsaturated just has the one. Okay. And that's the difference between a PUFA and a MUFA. A saturated fat has no double bonds. It is completely saturated. And so therefore, it's not going to have an opportunity. Why is this important? Because this is how you make trans fats. And I always joke, this goes over very well in nutrition crowds, that this is the only topic within nutrition that all nutrition professionals can agree on, that trans fats are bad for you. Everything else is up for debate.
True.
One of my pet peeves is a lot of people have associated hydrogenated and trans fats with animal fats. And that's inherently not accurate, because yes, animal fats are largely saturated fats. And yes, they do contain some poly and monounsaturated fats, but it's actually plant fats that are polyunsaturated and monounsaturated more, that have more of those double bonds, that have the opportunity to become trans fats. And all trans fats means is that it's got the way that the double bond is flipped is opposite versus cis, where they're both facing in the same direction. So cis is that top formation and trans is that middle formation. And saturated fats can't do that. So when we overheat, overprocess what we consider even healthy polyunsaturated or monounsaturated fat, we are more likely to end up with a trans fat. And that's why, or part of the reason why, ultra processed foods are potentially bad. In the controversy when it comes to seed oils, it's not necessarily the seed oil, it's the way that seed oil is processed that may expose it or increase the risk of creating a trans fat that potentially makes it inflammatory. There are plenty of seed oils that could potentially be healthy. It's just, how are they processed? How are they made? What's their shelf look like? And how are you using them to cook?
Yep.
Next, the other controversial topic, this cholesterol. Again, for decades, we were told not to eat too much cholesterol. It's only in the last year that we've actually started to repeal the limitation on how much cholesterol that we can eat. For years, we thought that this is what caused high cholesterol. As it turns out, it's actually a very small percentage of why people's cholesterol, our blood levels of cholesterol, go up. And in fact, if we over restrict cholesterol, we potentially lose the ability to make some of our hormones, like our sex hormones, our testosterone, our estrogen, our progesterone. And it's even a precursor for cortisol, which we have, Goldilocks rule, not too much, not too little, but it's also a precursor for another really important hormone, vitamin D. So another one that we're debunking now and starting to realize that the current recommendations that we limit high cholesterol foods, that we limit how much eggs we eat, for example, needs to be re-examined, because it's not necessarily true, for at least not for everybody. So let's shift gears and talk a little bit about the role of fats, and then we'll talk a little bit more about how this intersects with Eat the Rainbow. One of the reasons that fat was so vilified is because it's calorically dense. Proteins and carbs are 4 calories per gram, where fat is at actually more than double at 9 calories per gram, which means that if you eat fat, the old adage was you eat fat, you get fat because that's more calories. What we found out though is that actually fat can help you feel more satiated, more full. So when we start eating low fat diets, we start getting hungrier and we start craving more food. And it also helps to blunt blood sugar spikes. So it helps to balance your blood sugar intake. We also found out that, well, we knew that fat makes up components of cell membranes. And if you undereat fat, you have poor quality cell membranes. It's like having a water balloon that's like really cheap and that like just doesn't hold water the way it's supposed to. And it also being too low of a body fat percentage could potentially put us at risk because it's part of what regulates our body temperature and protects our vital organs as well. So again, Goldilocks rule, too much, too little. We got to stay in balance. Fat also provides energy for our brain, our mitochondria, our energy factories. It is what helps regulate inflammation. We think of fish oil and olive oil, great for regulating and reducing inflammation, essential for hormone production, as we talked about. And we need fat in order to absorb our fat soluble vitamins.
Yeah, I just want to introduce a little idea here, particularly on that last point, which is what I think is important about the Eat the Rainbow, and then as well as fats, is that a lot of these nutrients really work synergistically. And I think this is a great example of that. So, while we're mostly talking about increasing colorful fruits and vegetables, it's also really important to pay attention to making sure that you're getting in the other macronutrients, especially fat. So basically, what it means by helping to facilitate these fat soluble nutrient absorption is that without that, it's difficult. They need fat to be able to kind of move through the body in ways that we want them to. So that is an example of that would be eating a salad that has olive oil on it. You're going to have a much better time being able to kind of actually utilize and extract the vitamins like vitamin K and things like that from the leafy greens when you pair it with olive oil. And that's sort of just an example. We'll talk about this a little bit later and maybe next week as well. But these nutrients really have to work together in order to kind of get the maximum benefit from them.
Absolutely. And another example of that synergy, Sarah, that you just brought up brings me to short chain fatty acids. And short chain fatty acids are these compounds that they're like chemical messengers that are predominantly made in the microbiome by our gut bacteria, but they can also be in certain foods where the animal's gut bacteria actually made those saturated fats. And so they are rich in those foods. But these short chain fatty acids are helpful. They're part of the anti-inflammatory signaling that happens. They've been shown to improve body composition. Higher levels of short chain fatty acids are associated with a healthier gut microbiome and healthier mucosa. And they are shown to be associated with better blood sugar balance, reduced incidence of things like diabetes and cardiovascular disease and kidney disease. So very important component. And this to me is such a great example of where fat and feeding the microbiome intersects, because there are some fats that do help support the microbiome. It's the omega-3 fats, your alpha linoleic acid, that's things in chia seeds and flax seeds, as well as your fish oils, right? Those do actually help balance the microbiome. But more importantly, it's adding that colorful variety and the fibers from plants that helps to feed that microbiome, the microbiome that helps produce more of these saturated fatty acids. So it's finding that balance, it's coupling these components together that really kind of takes the concept of anti-inflammatory fats and takes it up to the next level. And you can't have one without the other. I think this is where ketogenic diets sometimes go wrong. Ketogenic diet on its own can be anti-inflammatory. Ketone production itself is anti-inflammatory. It helps to regulate certain metabolic function. Same with intermittent fasting, can be very anti-inflammatory. But if you're not feeding the microbiome, you're missing out on all the benefits of what a robust and diverse microbiome does to help support that anti-inflammatory picture.